all of this, I think, would have been fine. It could have gone on for millions of years in this climaxed situation. The orgies were lunar, meaning they probably occurred every 2 weeks or at most every 28 days. That means every 28 days, every member of this society was completely dissolving any psychic structures that may have arisen in the previous 28 days, and then everybody was just jumping on each other's bones in a big heap. And you can imagine the boundary dissolving impact that something like that would have. Why then, if it was so wonderful, didn't we just stick with it? Why the descent into, you know, the hell of Pee Wee Herman and Richard Nixon and all of this stuff? Well, the same culprit that created that happy story destroyed that happy scenario, and that is the continued drying up of the planet. And that's what we get in that Genesis story. Remember at the end of the Genesis story it says, and God set an angel at the eastern gate of Eden with a flaming sword so that Adam and his children could not find their way back into paradise. That's the memory of the Saharan sun scorching off the African veldt and forcing those mushroom-using pastoralists to settle in the Nile Valley and set up permanent settlements and begin thinking about kingship, large-scale agricultural projects, and so forth and so on. And what happened, it was not as simple as that may have made it seem, you see. This is really the theme of this book that I wrote for Bantam, is the theme that cultures wear drugs like clothing, and they're never aware of it. They just feel naked without their particular drug. And the clothing may differ. You know, one culture feels fully dressed in penis sheaths and war paint. Another culture isn't fully dressed unless the gown is by Dior. So there are different styles of clothing, and there are different styles of mental clothing in the form of drugs, and these drugs promote different kinds of cultural values. And what happened in this African situation was a tragedy that in a way we have seen enacted in microcosm in our own society. It was that at a certain point everything was perfect. The monthly orgies, the suppression of ego, the group values, the recent invention of language was making food gathering easy for women. The abundant game was making hunting easy for men, so forth and so on. But this drying of the African continent didn't halt there. It continued, and pretty soon there were problems. Less game, less to be gathered, and most important for my theory, fewer mushrooms. And when there became fewer mushrooms, then there were two possibilities. You could have your mushroom orgies less frequently, or you could create some kind of technology for preserving the mushrooms so that when you found a lot of them, you could save some of them for dry spells, literally for dry spells. Now, the problem with this strategy is that in a world without refrigeration, the strategy which Aboriginal people in Australia, in the Amazon basin, the strategy which Aboriginal people tend toward when they want to preserve some delicate food is they invariably go for honey. Honey. This is why some of you may know that the Romans ate hummingbirds' tongues pickled in honey. It isn't because honey was the preferred medium for pickling hummingbirds' tongues. It was because that's a way of preserving delicate food. The problem with honey is honey itself can ferment into a psychoactive compound. Honey changes into mead. Mead is a form of crude alcohol. The impact on a goddess-worshipping, orgiastic, non-hierarchical, non-male dominant culture of switching over to the use of alcohol is absolutely devastating. In the same way that I told you what psilocybin did, improves visual acuity, promotes sexual activity, delivers a religious experience, we can talk about what alcohol does. It lowers sensitivity to social cueing at the same time that it gives an empowered sense of ego. In other words, it makes you into a jerk. It gives you the courage to say and do what, if you are a decent person, you would otherwise never say and never do. It turns each one of us into a Clarence Thomas. This is not what's needed. Boo, yes, no, who knows? Who is Clarence Thomas anyway? And time again in human history, these kinds of synergies have been enacted. Well, I want to say more about it. That isn't the whole story. That could be the whole story. I mean, there's enough in that for it to be the whole story. In other words, if it's true that the mushroom suppresses male dominance, if it in fact promotes communal values and so forth, then what a wonderful thing it must be, and we can leave it there. But that's only a small part of the story. The real story is what is so wonderful about it. Since it's a mental experience, what is so wonderful about it that it could halt the human tendency to devolve into these counterproductive forms and lifestyles? Well, what is so great about it is that it is nothing less than half of the intellectual universe. It is what I call the connection to the Gaian mind. In other words, to this point, what I've said could be imputed to be just talk about a superb psychedelic drug. And so they're saying, oh, well, so this guy advocates the use of a superb psychedelic drug. It seems reasonable or unreasonable, depending on where you went to church. But it's not that paradigm challenging. But what is paradigm challenging is the content of the experience. The content of the experience is completely mind-boggling, completely befuddling. I don't know what we're going to do with the content of the experience, because fully gotten out and fully discussed and fully realized, it's not going to leave one brick upon another in the cheerfully naive edifice that our half-baked civilization has erected as universal truth. We're not going to, science is not going to be able to survive the encounter with the psychedelic experience, because it is not an encounter with the Freudian, the repressed memories of your miserable and battered childhood or whatever it is you went through, and it isn't even an encounter with the miserable memories of the battered childhood of the human species that we all went through, a la Carl Jung. That is all there. But that's in the hallway where you hang your hat and the antechamber where they take your coat. The main event, folks, doesn't even have anything to do with the psychology of human beings. The main event is another dimension, a dimension so bizarre, so titanically peculiar, so strange, so unanticipated by our language, our history, our literature, that it is literally like the discovery